Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this 13th edition of the Oppenheim Institute at Temple Hesed. I'm especially pleased and proud to introduce tonight's speaker. One of the major tenets of Judaism, and especially of Reform Judaism, is our search for and support of social justice, not just among our own people, but civil justice for all people. It's to that purpose that our family established this institute, promising to present provocative programming to our congregation and indeed to the entire community. Tonight's program is unique. For one thing, we're fortunate to have chosen someone right here on our home ground here in Scranton, in Lackawanna County, in Pennsylvania, the Bishop of the Diocese of Scranton, Most Reverend Joseph Bambera, was appointed in 2010 to serve as 10th Bishop of Scranton. Prior to his appointment, he had served the diocese in a variety of capacities. He earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Pittsburgh in 1978, and he then entered St. Pius X Seminary in Dalton to begin studies for the priesthood. During that time, he attended the University of Scranton, pursuing courses in theology and philosophy, and he was awarded a Master of Divinity degree by Mary Immaculate Seminary in Northampton in 1982. In 1991, he was awarded a licentiate in canon law from St. Paul's University in Ottawa, Canada, and a master's degree in canon law from the University of Ottawa. Pope Francis has embarked upon and is leading his church in directions that are new and even radical in terms of past practices. So we've invited tonight's speaker to address and interpret for us this new direction. So please help me to welcome the Bishop of the Diocese of Scranton, the Most Reverend Joseph C. Bambera.
Just last month, much of the world watched with great interest Pope Francis's three-day pilgrimage to Amman, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem. I'm not certain if you knew that he was accompanied by two dear friends from Argentina, Rabbi Abraham Skorka, the rector of the Latin America Rabbinical Seminary in Buenos Aires, and Omar Aboud, the former Secretary General of the Islamic Center of Argentina. In his address in Jerusalem to the two chief rabbis of Israel, Pope Francis shared these words: "We need to do more than simply establish reciprocal and respectful relations on a human level. We are also called as Christians and Jews to reflect deeply on the spiritual significance of the bond existing between us. It is a bond whose origins are from on high, one which transcends our own plans and projects, one which remains intact despite all of the difficulties that sadly have marked our relationship in the past. May the Lord help us to walk with confidence and strength in his ways." What a wonderful reflection and prayer as we begin this time together tonight. With deep appreciation and respect, I wish to thank Jane Oppenheim, Rabbi Schwartz, and the congregation of Temple Hesed for the kind invitation to speak with you this evening. Your invitation honors not only me, but countless numbers of Catholics who are the Church of the Diocese of Scranton throughout northeastern and north central Pennsylvania. Your invitation also acknowledges the deep bonds that we share as a people of faith. May the Lord indeed help us walk together with confidence and strength in his ways. Now, just as an aside, you do have with your worship bulletin a brief outline of what I'd like to talk about tonight. You have that for a number of reasons. I'm a little bit of a type A personality, so I do things in somewhat of order. The second thing is, you'll know when I'm close to coming in for a landing. And the third and final point about this piece of paper is that if it gets really bad, it's blank on the back, and you can probably do your grocery list for tomorrow. One more thing I'd like to say, Rabbi and Jane, thank you for continually reminding the congregation tonight that there's food, and the only thing that stands between the food and them is me. So, here we go. Since his election as Bishop of Rome in March 2013, Pope Francis has received a number of accolades. Time and The Advocate magazine named Francis the Person of the Year last December. Now, this one I like. Esquire magazine named him as the best-dressed man of 2013 for his simpler vestments, often in tune with more modern fashion designs. I think I have some hope here. Fortune magazine ranked Francis as number 1 on their list of the 50 greatest leaders in the world. And even Elton John was so taken by this pope that he described him as a miracle of humility in an age of vanity. It's a wonderful, wonderful image. In a little over a year, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the former Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Argentina, and now the 266th successor of Peter, the first leader of the Roman Catholic Church, has captured the imagination, the admiration, and the love of seemingly the entire world. And so tonight we ask the question, why? What about this man has so attracted Catholics and Protestants, Jews, Muslims, and people of various religious traditions and no religious traditions at all? Why are we so attracted to him? I would propose that what's particularly appealing about him are 2 qualities: his openness to others, and secondly, his willingness to engage and listen to others with care. Qualities of human interaction that Pope Francis refers to as a culture of encounter. A culture of encounter. Those are important words. Hold on to them as we talk about Pope Francis and his impact in our world today. To understand these qualities of Pope Francis, as a starting point, providentially, I think it's probably best if we look to his relationship with Rabbi Skorka, whom I mentioned a moment ago and who accompanied him to Israel in his recent trip. In 2010, Cardinal Bergoglio and Rabbi Skorka published a book entitled On Heaven and Earth. This is the book. You can probably find it in a lot of bookstores or online. I get no proceeds from this. It's just an easy read. It's interesting. And it's a wonderful exchange between the then Cardinal of Buenos Aires and his friend Rabbi Skorka. I'd really recommend it to you. In his introduction to the book, then Cardinal Bergoglio begins by referring to one of the rabbi's earlier writings. And in the rabbi's writings, the rabbi reflects upon the facade of the Roman Catholic Cathedral in Buenos Aires. The relief on the facade depicts the encounter of Joseph and his brothers from the book of Genesis. You all know the story well. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers who were jealous of him. And when a famine came on the land where his brothers were living, they made their way to Egypt, where their brother Joseph had risen to power. And they encounter him in their quest for food and nourishment, and suddenly they realize that it's their brother. In reflecting upon the rabbi's thoughts about that image, Pope Francis shared these sentiments. In that encounter between Joseph and his brothers. There is weeping among them, and also an endearing question: is my father still alive? Do you remember that? Is my father still alive? This scene, Pope Francis says, works to establish the culture of encounter. Brother engaging brother, son engaging father. And yet, the Pope reflects, at times, sadly, we're better able to identify ourselves as builders of walls rather than builders of bridges. So often, there is an absence of dialogue. Those are important themes: dialogue, relationships, encounter. 2 weeks ago, this coming Sunday, Pope Francis plunged headfirst into the Middle East peacemaking process when he welcomed to the Vatican Israeli President Shimon Peres and Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas for an evening of peace prayers, just weeks after the last round of U.S.-sponsored negotiations collapsed. Here's what the Holy Father said: peacemaking calls for courage, much more than warfare. Pope Francis said it calls for the courage to say yes to encounter and no to conflict. Yes to encounter and no to conflict. Who knows what will come from that exchange? Yet the fact that these three men encountered one another in a spirit of harmony and prayer is monumental. What an example the three of them are for all people of goodwill as we journey to find peace in our world. The desire to establish this culture of encounter or dialogue is a central theme that will help us better understand Pope Francis, and particularly his way of relating to the church and the world in a way that instills hope. It's also foundational for his vision of the church. Let me explain a little bit. Not surprisingly, some of you have probably listened to interviews that the Pope has given, have read some of them perhaps in publications. He admits readily and quite frankly often of how he's learned over the years from mistakes. That we all had that good sense to say what we learned from what we did wrong or mistakenly. In an interview he gave last August, Francis affirmed that fact, particularly when he found himself as provincial superior of the Jesuits in Argentina. He had been elected as their leader at the ripe old age of 36. He's quoted as saying, "Now, wasn't that a crazy thing to do?" Sometimes I ask myself about my own position and wonder the same. But here's what the Holy Father says. He said, "I had to deal with difficult situations, and I made my decisions abruptly and by myself in those early years. And eventually I came to realize that people get tired of authoritarianism. People like to be involved and engaged in helping to make decisions." Pope Francis then added that over the years, he gradually began to learn the value of decision-making that's rooted in extensive consultation, decisions that emerge from a culture of encounter. Indeed, the principle can be clearly seen as characterizing Francis's entire approach to life and ministry and his ultimate vision for the church. I'm sure not a few of you have heard of his, quote, gang of 8 cardinals who represent 6 of the 7 continents that he brings together on a regular basis to help him make decisions about the future of the Catholic Church. But perhaps his most compelling words that reflect his commitment to this philosophy of encounter emerged in an address to participants at last fall's International Meeting for Peace. Here's what he said. "Peace requires persistent, patient, strong, intelligent dialogue by which nothing is lost. Each one of us is called to be an artisan of peace, uniting, not dividing, by extinguishing hatred and not holding on to it, by opening paths to dialogue and not by constructing new walls. So let us dialogue and meet one another in order to establish a culture of dialogue in our world, indeed, a culture of encounter. Now, with this culture of encounter serving as a foundational element of the ministry of Francis, I'd like to share with you some essential principles or building blocks maintained by the Pope that complement his belief in the value of human encounter and from which his vision of hope and mercy for the Church emerges. Shortly after his installation as Pope on March 19, 2013, Francis offered insights into a reality that has helped to shape his life and ministry from its beginning. What a beautiful truth of faith this is for our lives, Francis said. The mercy of God. God's love for us is so great, so deep. It is an unfailing love, one which always takes us by the hand and supports us, lifts us up, and leads us on. The mercy of God. My friends, mercy, more than any other theme, along with the notion of encounter that I've just described at length, is woven into virtually every aspect of Francis's vision for the Church. I might add that it is particularly fitting that we all have the opportunity to reflect upon the notion of mercy tonight as we gather in this beautiful house of worship dedicated to God's mercy, Temple Hesed. As you know well, Hesed being the Hebrew word commonly translated as loving kindness or mercy. What a wonderful place to reflect, to celebrate, and to pray. Last November, Pope Francis published a 140-page document outlining his vision for the Church. He entitled it Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel. He begins the document by reflecting upon the Church's mission of evangelization. And evangelization is quite simply the basic and principal work in the Church. It's the proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ, the proclamation of Jesus' gospel in word and in deed. Francis states very clearly that this work is to be characterized, the work of proclaiming the good news, with joy, because it's that which brings us life and peace and meaning and purpose and hope to our lives. A joy which is ever new, and a joy which those who call themselves Christians are called to share abundantly and generously. And so with a focus upon the joy that comes from faith and the challenge given to all believers to move beyond our own interests and concerns, to share this joy in our service of others, especially the poor, Pope Francis, in that major document, discusses at length several things that are key to understanding his vision of the Church. I'll give you 5 points, not 140 pages. As just noted, Pope Francis's primary theme in all that he does and all that he is about is the mercy of God. Here are a few other themes that he develops. The reform of the Church in her outreach to the world. The temptations faced by pastoral workers. Preaching and its preparation. Sensitivity to the poor and those who are marginalized and burdened. And peace that grows from dialogue in society. I want you to notice the nature of these themes. I won't bother to repeat them, but let me carry you through a reflection briefly upon them. The Pope first focuses our attention both inwardly upon the life and ministry of the church, when he calls for reform of the church, when he calls for pastoral ministers to understand what they do, when he speaks about preaching. But then he shifts our focus outwardly upon the church's relationship with the world, our concern for the poor, and our call to work for peace and reconciliation. Now, for example, looking inwardly at the life of the Catholic Church, the Pope addressed church reform, acknowledging very forthrightly the papacy and the central struggles of the universal church also need to hear the call to conversion. So often when we think of conversion, we think of it as something outside of ourselves, calling people into our community of faith. The Pope has a different starting point. He says conversion starts within and is first and most significantly embraced when we embrace it as leaders within the church, including himself. He says excessive centralization, rather than being helpful, often complicates the life of the church and its missionary outreach to the poor. And then he adds something so down to earth and wonderful in its perspective. One realizes that in addition to being pastor of the Universal Catholic Church, this man was a pastor of a congregation not unlike this congregation for many, many years. He says pastoral ministry must seek to abandon the complacent attitudes that says, and you've all heard this before, pastoral ministry must always seek to abandon this notion. But we have always done it that way. Now, we do that in the Catholic Church all the time. I suspect that doesn't happen here. We've always done it that way. Now, that might be part of tradition, but yet, the Pope states, in today's vast and rapid cultural changes, we must constantly seek ways of expressing unchanging truths in a language that brings about their abiding newness. In other words, speak the truth of what we believe and profess in a language that the world understands, in a way that contemporary generations can interpret easily and well. Pope Francis also looks outward to the world in which the church exists. He expresses his ever-present belief in the need for social dialogue in three standout areas for the purpose of promoting full human development, the common good, and peace. He asserts that there must be dialogue with states, dialogue with society that includes dialogue with culture and science, and there must also be dialogue with other believers who are not a part of the Catholic Church. How wonderful it is that Jews and Catholics join together tonight to reflect on our common ground and belief in God. Basically, the Holy Father eschews the church turning in upon itself and instead advocates that we must encounter the world in a vibrant way. Providentially, this section of the document that Pope Francis wrote addresses relations with Judaism. Allow me to share with you briefly some of the sentiments of Pope Francis. They speak powerfully to our gathering this evening and to our shared faith and commitment as believers. This is Pope Francis speaking. We hold the Jewish people in special regard because their covenant with God has never been revoked. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. The church, which shares with Jews an important part of the sacred scriptures, looks upon the people of the covenant and their faith as one of the sacred roots of our own Christian identity. With them, we believe in the one God who acts in history, and with them, we accept his revealed word. Indeed, God continues to work among the people of the covenant and to bring forth treasures of wisdom which flow from their encounter with his word. For this reason, the church is also enriched when she receives the values and the gifts of Judaism. What a powerful reflection on our relationship one to another. Our reflections thus far this evening have centered upon the person of Pope Francis, whose vision for the church clearly results because of his belief and appreciation for both the notion of God's mercy and the shared mission of all believers, a mission that's characterized by faith, inclusion, conversion, and dialogue. I'd like to now focus briefly on what I would describe as the 5 key elements of Pope Francis's vision for the church and ultimately for our world. The first element of his vision. In an interview last August, which I referred to already, we hear Pope Francis describe the church as a field hospital after battle. This is what he says about the church in that regard. I see clearly that the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness and proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. It's useless to ask a seriously injured person, and I love this language, it's useless to ask a person who's seriously ill if he has high cholesterol or about the level of his blood sugar. I didn't even know popes knew about those things. Instead, Pope Francis said, you have to heal wounds first. Then we can talk about everything else. So heal wounds. Start from the ground up. Unfortunately, the church has locked itself up in small things over the years, in small-minded rules. The most important thing is the first proclamation that Jesus has saved you. And the ministers of the church then must be ministers of God's mercy above all else. And once again, we hear that foundational principle of his life and ministry, mercy. In pastoral ministry, we must accompany people and we must heal their wounds. We must be a church of mercy, as this beautiful house of worship calls all of you to embrace as well. The second element of Pope Francis's vision takes the church outside of itself. To this end, in an address to lay movements who gathered in Rome on Pentecost Sunday last May, Pope Francis said the church must go outside of itself. To where and what do you mean? To the outskirts of existence, wherever people may be, the church must step out. In St. Mark's Gospel, we're heard, go into all the world, go, preach, bear witness to the truth. But the Pope then asks, what happens if we step outside of ourselves? And he answers the question, the same thing that can happen to anybody who steps outside of his or her house, an accident. But I tell you, I far prefer a church that has had a few accidents to a church that has fallen sick from being closed. I remember as a young child, oftentimes spending time at my grandmother's house, and her invitation to me and my cousins would always be, go outside. Go outside and get some fresh air, you'll feel better. It's the same image that Pope Francis talks about. Go outside of yourselves. Don't be worried about your small world, but go reach the poor, reach those who are alienated, reach those who need to be healed, and welcome them and make them feel that they are indeed recipients of God's mercy and love. And then he shares these wonderful words at the end of that element and his reflections upon it. We cannot become starched Christians, those overeducated individuals who speak about theological matters as they sip their cups of tea. So, go out. is what he says to all of us. The third element, Pope Francis has a vision to grow the church in such a way that it becomes an institution that is poor for the poor. And this is so key and so significant to the life and ministry of Pope Francis. So much of his ministry in Argentina focused in a very tangible way upon his outreach to the poor in the barrios, in all sorts of neighborhoods and regions where people literally went from day to day not knowing if they'd have enough food to eat. And he was there to feed them, to heal them, to touch them, and to give them the sense of respect for who they are as individuals, not for what they had or what they could do. But this vision of Pope Francis's concern for the poor perhaps finds its greatest focus when we look at his name. When we look at his name that comes from Francis of Assisi, as Rabbi Schwartz quoted so beautifully earlier this evening. Immediately upon accepting his election as Bishop of Rome, the Cardinal of Buenos Aires asserted to those gathered in the Sistine Chapel, "I shall be called Francis." And for the first time in the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church, the name of Francis of Assisi was chosen by a successor of St. Peter. The next day after his election, Pope Francis met with journalists, and he explained how the name came about. He said, "As the election was unfolding, I sat next to the Archbishop Emeritus of Sao Paulo, Brazil, Cardinal Claudio Humes, a dear, dear friend. And when the votes reached the 2/3, there was the usual applause because the Pope had been elected. And my friend Cardinal Humes hugged me, and he whispered in my ears, and he said, 'Jorge, do not forget the poor. Do not forget the poor.' And the Pope continued, 'Those words came to me. The poor, the poor.' And then right away, thinking of the poor, I thought of Francis of Assisi. And then I thought of all the wars as the votes were still being counted. Francis is also a man of peace. That is how the name came into my heart, Francis of Assisi. For me, he is the man of poverty, the man of peace, the man who loves and protects creation. How I would love a church which is poor for the poor." The fourth element of the Pope's vision is seeing authority as service. You may remember that in his homily in St. Peter's Square at his Mass of inauguration for his ministry as Bishop of Rome on March 19th, 2013, Pope Francis captured the attention of the world as he shared these words: "Authentic power is service." That doesn't always fit with our understanding, does it? Authentic power in our world is service. He went on to say, "I would like to ask all those who have positions of responsibility in economic, political, and social life, and all men and women of goodwill, let us be protectors of creation, protectors of one another and of the environment. But to be protectors, we also have to keep watch over ourselves. Let us not forget that hatred, envy, and pride defile our lives. Being protectors then also means keeping watch over our emotions, over our hearts. We must not be afraid of goodness or even tenderness. To protect the whole of creation, to protect each person, especially the poorest, to protect ourselves. This is the service that the Bishop of Rome is called to carry out, yet one to which each person in this world is also challenged to embrace, to serve one another as a sign of authentic power in our world. In one of his daily homilies last month, Pope Francis pointed out that some of those who follow Jesus aren't interested in serving, but sometimes they're interested in a search for power. And even in the church, he said, there are climbers, people driven by ambition. There are many of them. But if you like climbing, Pope Francis said, and I suspect he was saying that to people in my own walk of life, he said, if you like climbing, then I'd suggest that you go to the mountains and climb them. They're healthier. Do not come to the church. Come to the church to serve. And that's an invitation, certainly, to me and my colleagues, but that's an invitation to all believers to serve in the spirit that God has placed in our hearts through faith. My friends, it is quite apparent that Pope Francis has done more than challenge his own church. I truly believe in his words he's challenging our wider culture's whole approach to leadership by embodying a refreshing, deeply countercultural vision of how leaders live and what they value in life. He reminds us time and time again that authentic power is found in service, going beyond ourselves to respond to the needs of our sisters and brothers. The fifth and final element of Pope Francis's vision for the church that I'd like to share with you this evening is found in his deep respect for our environment. In keeping true to his namesake, Francis of Assisi, who praised God for the gift of creation, Pope Francis plans to write his second encyclical, his second major teaching in the church about protecting the environment. Just last Wednesday, in his general audience, the Pope shared these thoughts. The first chapter of Genesis, at the very beginning of the Bible, shows us that God delights in his creation by repeatedly emphasizing the beauty and goodness of all things. And at the end of each day, it is written, God saw that it was good. But if God sees that creation is something good and beautiful, we have to have the same attitude. We must see creation as something good and beautiful and to be cherished. Pope Francis continued, we are custodians of creation, not masters of it. But when we exploit creation, we destroy the sign of God's love for us. So safeguard creation, because if we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. So what of this vision of Pope Francis, who described himself the night he was elected as the man coming from the ends of the earth, from a faraway land? I'd propose a few things in summary. Pope Francis proclaims a vision of a church that is deeply committed to the poor, the wounded, and the marginalized. His vision flows from a commitment to human encounter and dialogue, something that we have not often heard in the church at such high levels of leadership. It is a vision that beckons all believers to give flesh and substance to what they profess through their lives of service. It is a vision that challenges all people of goodwill, regardless of their religious tradition, to live and love generously and authentically. It is a vision of profound appreciation for the gift of creation. It is a vision that gives hope, for its core is the mercy of God for all people. And it is a vision, I might add, that has caused many, both within the Catholic Church and beyond, to view Pope Francis as a radical agent of change. In fact, he would take exception to that. For he's asserted in many ways that he is not at all about change for change's sake. He has expressed and exhibited time and again his fidelity to the teachings of the Church. Through his vision, Pope Francis has simply yet consistently sought to engage the people of God, our world and our culture, through dialogue and an exchange of ideas, to ensure that the Church speaks authentically, always, the message of God's mercy at this time and moment in its history. Pope Francis's goal is to translate the good news of all that we believe and profess into a language that is understandable and into lives that desperately need love and mercy. If that goal is dependent upon change, then so be it. Timothy Dolan, the Cardinal of New York, captured very well the person and the message of Pope Francis. The Cardinal stated that Francis is a natural communicator of Christian truths and the Catholic faith. His words and actions are not a public relations ploy or gimmick. They are simply who Pope Francis is. Nobody had to sit him down and say, Pope Francis, listen, we think it would be really great if you concentrated on talking about God's mercy and forgiveness. There is simply no way somebody could script this man. What you see is what you get. The world is responding because his whole life is dedicated to conveying the good news simply and sincerely in everything that he does. I hope in some way I've given you the opportunity to know a little bit more about this deeply humble servant of God. The hope that he has provided for many through his vision for the church and his message of God's mercy and love for humankind. Thank you, my brothers and sisters, for allowing me to share these thoughts with you this evening. Shalom.